world am I doing this? Here I am risking my life unnecessarily. Why am I doing this?
I want to tell people what's going on in the world. I want to try and get it absolutely right and convey all that's there. I have a passion about that, and I feel also passionately about what I see.
When journalists talk about a front row seat in history, that is literally what we had. From the balcony, we saw a unique historical era blown to bits.
People think that being a journalist is glamorous. It's not. It's potentially very deadly work. I've been very, very lucky. Others, unfortunately, have not.
They fly from their comfortable beds to face bullets and bombs in foreign lands.
I love going to war. I'm excited by war.
Fighting is the easiest story in the world to cover. It really is easy. It's very, very dangerous and may require being in good physical condition, but not much more than that, because it's happening for you.
You have to say to yourself, look, I'm obviously not going to get out of this alive, so I don't need to worry about that. I can put that out of my mind.
For journalists, war reporting is perhaps the most compelling work of all, but it's also a career that claims more than its fair share of casualties.
We all got into this job because we wanted to make an impact, but you don't realize the impact that that might have, least of all on yourself.
The effect on survivors was blind panic.
I spent 5 days in Chechnya and I said, get me out of here. It was horrific. We think Bosnia was bad, we think Sarajevo was bad. I just thought, I can't cope with this. And I thought, this is absurd, absolutely absurd.
We're going home, which is the place you go to after a war when you've been as lucky as we've been.
Of course the demons are there, and I've been told that I scream in my sleep. Yeah. But I'd be fascinated to know who told you.
And if you'll excuse me, I just want to break off because we've had some incoming sniper fire.
In this program, we meet the war correspondents who risked their lives for us.
After hours of shooting and facing
total panic.
And we hear the stories behind the stories that have made our daily papers and news bulletins. We also trace the increasing risk to journalists over the years as more and more die in accidents, friendly fire incidents, and in recent years, at the hands of soldiers and armed civilians who seem determined to kill the messenger. It was billed as the war to end all wars, and it was the first truly modern war, with tanks and chemical warfare and moving pictures and millions dead. But from a reporting point of view, nothing much had changed in World War I from the previous century. The reporters of those wars, embedded with the troops nearly a century before the Pentagon coined the phrase, did very little reporting as we now know it. For governments of the time had no desire for people at home to know the true horror of war. But reporters both then and now have been charged with being the eyes and ears, and sometimes the conscience of a nation at war.
I've seen people killed in front of me, and even if they die quickly, it is a moment of intense, disgusting, obscene pain that no human being, man or woman, should ever have to go through. Wars represent, for me, the total failure of the human spirit.
You see the most venal, awful things, and you see wonderful heroism and humanity and compassion, as well as hatred. Everything is there.
There are others, many, many others in those places who are much more endangered than we are. The ordinary people who have no choice whether they come or go, and for whom there is no glory and no front page and no Pulitzer Prize to be won.
War reporting is the most competitive branch of journalism there is. There are winners and losers. One of the things I tried to do against the trend, especially towards the end of my years, was to get people to work together rather than to work against each other, because they were getting killed for competition and for prizes and to be reporter of the year. It's crap, and it's not worth it.
For months past, Mussolini has been sending the flower of Italy's manhood to Africa. Even his own sons are serving in the Italian Air Force, the wings of the Roman eagle ready to kill and to destroy.
In 1935, a nasty little war broke out in Africa.
10 million dark-skinned tribesmen, untrained in modern military tactics, armed for the most part only with spears, but in a frenzy of determination.
Reporters were sent from around the globe to Abyssinia to witness the tragic results of Benito Mussolini's imperial ambitions. Amongst them, the 22-year-old correspondent of the Morning Post of London.
There were some fairly poignant scenes when the Abyssinians paraded what they thought was their army. I mean, many of it barefooted and not even uniformed. There was quite a lot of picturesque reporting to be done about this ragtail army facing the modern Italian army. All that made a certain amount of drama.
They may well hold their own against a modern army. After all, at close quarters, a spear can be as deadly as a rifle. So the Ethiopian...
And then there was always the weather, which was eccentric. Who came up on the railway and the movements of the emperor.
The emperor, the railway, and the weather. Not perhaps the stuff of modern war reporting, but just 3 years later, a new war threatened all civilization. In the early years of World War II, when American naval convoys made their way to Europe, the exact status of the war correspondents aboard was somewhat ambiguous. They were given officers' uniforms with a big C on the arm.
My first assignment shortly after Pearl Harbor was covering the Atlantic battle to beat the submarines, and I was on a battleship on the first major convoy going across, and I was wearing this uniform. And for a couple of days I kept going to the wardroom, and it seemed to me that it was a very quiet group. Matter of fact, it seemed to me they even quieted down as I approached. I couldn't figure this out until about the second night. I was finally in conversation with a group of them, and one of them said, by the way, what religion are you? And I said, oh, I'm kind of a jackass Episcopalian. And their eyes kind of opened up, and they said, well, do you have a church? I said, well, not really. I don't go as regularly as I should. And now their eyes are even getting wider, you know. And one of them said, well, did you go to a seminary or what? I said, no, I've nothing like that. I said, how long have you been a chaplain? I said, chaplain? They assumed because I was introduced by the chaplain, I had this big C on my arm, and I was a chaplain.
World War II was to provide a unique opportunity for journalists. Radios had arrived in every home, and a new breed of war correspondent emerged.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London.
Men like Edward R. Murrow.
This afternoon, the Prime Minister left his residence at number 10 Downing Street and walked...
The last survivor of Murrow's team of reporters is Richard C. Hotlett. In 1945, Hotlett accompanied an airborne invasion of Germany, but got more than he bargained for.
Probably the closest I came to being killed, we were hit by flak. It sounded like somebody hitting us with a sledgehammer. We were flying very low. Altitude was 800 or 900 feet. The number 2 engine was on fire, and the crew chief came out and rang the gong, and the gong on the B-17 was the signal to get out. And I quickly hitched up my parachute and followed one of the colonels out the door. I was the second one out. The man behind me did not make it. He had what was called a streamer. His chute did not open, and he hit the ground.
Vital supplies,
oil and guns and ammunition as well as reinforcements of manpower, trudging east from Gibraltar on a voyage of 1,000 miles.
In 1942, with the war going badly for the Allies, the largest naval convoy ever to leave Britain's shores set out for the strategically vital base on Malta to provide food and oil to the beleaguered island's defenders. Newsreel cameraman Ted Candy was on one of the 78 ships. Once they reached the Mediterranean, the convoy was attacked by German and Italian planes and U-boats. Just 5 merchant ships got through, and Candy's, laden with thousands of tons of aviation fuel and ammunition, was not one of them.
The deck opened like a beautiful rose on fire. I was on top of the wheelhouse, filming the attack, when the captain came out of the wheelhouse and said, "Abandon ship, every man for himself." And then I jumped straight over the side. The sea caught fire, and that was the only time I was really frightened.
We had to report then that our cameraman Edward Candy was missing, believed killed. We have splendid news this week. He is safe. He was picked up and he reached the shores of Tunisia.
On his return to Britain, Candy went back to work again. And then in 1944, he was ordered to film the biggest military and media event ever, the D-Day landings at Normandy. Stars and Stripes reporter Andy Rooney landed in France on day 4 of the invasion.
The first casualties are brought out.
I think there were 6,000 people killed on D-Day alone. And I came in on D4, and it was one of the most wrenching scenes of my life. The Graves Registrations Unit, imagine working for the Graves Registration Unit, had brought the dead bodies, picked them up on the beach or right behind the beach, and had laid them all out in a row on the beach. And they all had olive drab blankets over them. And I just, it's such a memory for me. Here they were all lying there, boys all so different, and their feet sticking out with these GI shoes on. Their shoes all the same, and the boys so different. I never got over that, all dead.
Still haunt you?
It does. That's one of the few haunting memories I have of World War II. Those poor bastards who died on the beach, gee.
Though they could largely go where they liked, the many thousands of accredited Allied war correspondents during World War II were still required to wear uniform and were subject to military orders and discipline.
We had just hit a bump in our Jeep, and my helmet had flown off, and it had rolled into the snow in a field there. And I told the driver to stop, and I wanted to pick up my helmet, and I suddenly realized there were a bunch of signs there, all of them warning against mines, Achtung Minen, in 4 or 5 languages. And so obviously I wasn't going to go into that field just to recover a helmet. Even if General Patton insisted on everybody wearing his helmet, he'd have to understand if he caught me, which he wouldn't, I thought. We hadn't gone a mile down the road, the crowded highway convoys, when here we heard a little siren, saw the little red light flashing, and here comes his Jeep, and they pass us. And sure enough, if they don't squeal to a stop, his aide is out of the Jeep, a colonel, pointing at me and said, "Okay, soldier, where's your helmet? Where's your helmet?" And I said, "Well, I'm not a soldier, I'm a correspondent." He went back to the Jeep, and you could see him explaining this to Patton. I could almost see Patton's lips, and I can tell you that they weren't praising the press exactly.
For all Patton's anger, and in spite of all the danger, only 39 journalists were killed during the 6 years of combat of World War II. Less than 20 years later, Vietnam.
that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Nothing had prepared me for any minute in Vietnam because the emotions were so profound. But nothing prepared me for seeing dead Vietnamese, dead GIs, nothing. Everything came as a shock. I never quite got used to it. And I never quite got the swing of it. I could never accept it.
From behind, stop. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Gloria Emerson was one of the few women to cover this war in the jungle and deltas of Southeast Asia. Prior to going to Vietnam, Gloria reported on fashion from Paris. She had to fight her male bosses to get sent to Saigon.
The whole idea was so foreign to them. It went against their culture. They were of a generation of men who thought that men are supposed to protect women, and it wasn't their fault. And they thought the war was over when they decided to send me at the end of '69. And it was safe to send me. Wrong they were. They didn't want me to get killed. It would have been so embarrassing. One dead white woman is an awful mess.
Gloria's editors in New York may never have had to deal with that awful mess. But did she cover the biggest story of her time any differently from her male colleagues?
The male press corps was constantly following the American troops to report on any action in the field, as though this were the only way of testing themselves. But I wanted to write about the Vietnamese people in the South and how the war was touching them or not. And I had a brilliant interpreter, and we set off to do this, uncertain and trembling. And Vietnamese talked to us. I don't know why, but they did. No man ever wrote about the Vietnamese people. They considered it slightly effeminate to do that kind of a story when there was a real war going on, and grenades and mortars and tanks and armored personnel carriers.
So not for you the stories about the 101st Cavalry making it
Well, sometimes I had to do the 101st Cavalry. Sometimes I got caught up and there was an operation, and I had to go along. When the Americans went into Cambodia, I went along and got into trouble and was ambushed on Route 1 coming back, and they were very cross with me in New York, very cross.
God damn it, we're in the middle of these guys. We seem to be pinned down by snipers. One, possibly two armed personnel carriers that preceded us in here have been blown. One behind us is a...
The 700 or so reporters who went to Vietnam over the years had complete freedom to report the war as they wished.
Right now. What'd they get hit by?
I don't know. No comments.
Take care.
Seconds later, the boy is dead, blown to bits when the tank exploded.
There was no question I had luck because on probably 3 or 4 or perhaps 5 occasions, shot down the helicopter. It must have been 200 holes. The sound man got hit by a spent bullet. Just bruised his arm, didn't break the skin.
Repose.
Went down again in a helicopter, and it was a very heavy landing, as they said. Walked away from that. So, yeah, lots of luck.
Part of the challenge was to be smart and try and stay alive, try and figure out where the war was, how to cover it, and hope for enough good luck that you could A, report it, and B, make it back alive.
Get our stuff out. We took an awful lot of risks there, and I think we went much further to cover the war. We took much greater risks then, personally, than I think people do today. If you don't have luck, forget it. Become a bus driver. You simply can't succeed in war reporting unless you're an immensely lucky person, and I am an incredibly lucky person.
This is the first time we've been up Highway 13.
It isn't just luck. Instinct, superstition, experience all play a part in staying alive.
If you come to a village and there are no chickens around, turn back. Because that means either the villagers have gone with their chickens or the Viet Cong have taken their chickens and they're around. So I looked through my binoculars and there were no chickens, no movement. I was with the French crew and I said, well, what do you think? And they said, well, it's up to you. I said, let's forget it. Let's go somewhere else. Let's look for the war somewhere else today. And at that moment, a lovely photographer, a French photographer called Michel Laurent turned up. He worked for AP. I'd known him a long time, very brave photographer. And he said, let's go down together. We'll be okay. And I said, no, Michel, there's nothing moving down there. I don't like it. It looks wrong. Come on, he said, you know. Now, Michel was especially anxious because he'd been away for a month. He'd had personal problems at home. He'd gone back to Paris and they'd sent a replacement. And that young replacement had got some great pictures. So Michel was desperate to get to the status that he had been when he left. I said, Michel, you go. We're not going. At that moment, a car turned up with another young French photographer. And Michel persuaded him to go down. By the time he got back to Saigon, we learnt that Michel and the photographer were both dead. They'd gone into the village, they'd been fired at, that Michel was hit, the other guy was dead by that time, and as Michel got out of the car, they machine-gunned him down.
Michel Laurent was the last of 63 journalists to die in Vietnam.
I was prepared to die, I accepted the fact. I had a note in my pocket who to call. And at times I almost wished I would die. It'd be so much simpler. Just check out. Not have to make sense of the memories. It was all difficult. It was just a question of more difficult, less difficult. A blacker nightmare, a whiter nightmare. There is no in between.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them blue.
The war degraded us terribly, and it deformed us.
To myself, what a wonderful world.
Too much death, too many burns, too many blinded, too many amputees, too many prisoners. Too much beautiful land being destroyed by the bombings in Agent Orange. I didn't know it would cause quite so much pain for so long.
Having pressured for so long to be sent there, does Gloria Emerson ultimately regret going to Vietnam?
Yes. That's the question that endures. Yes.
Would you be different if you hadn't gone?
Yes.
How would you
I'd be
different?
working for Vogue, and I'd have a rich husband who was a broker, and we'd have a house in Southampton, and I'd be drinking every afternoon. Not a bad life. I don't think, as a journalist, you can go on pretending your stories made a difference. They were like ice cubes. They melted. Who was saved? Who rose from the grave? What was prevented? All that writing, all that typing. What happened because of those stories? Very little.
You must leave now, take what you need, you think will last.
For 150 years now, men, and more recently women, have been going to war, not to fight, but to tell stories.
Yonder stands your orphan with his gun.
At a time when the risk to reporters is actually growing, why are an ever-increasing number, more than 3,000 in the last Iraq War, so anxious to sign on as war correspondents?
Look out, baby, the saints are coming through. And it's all over now, baby blue.
You know it's exciting. You know that it's totally unpredictable. You also know that if it's happening big, it's going to be the lead story. I like every journalist, I like to be the lead story.
I mean, what a privilege. You can say, stop, hang on, I'm going to tell you something, just one thing that's significant. Please listen and look. I mean, that's a fantastic chance.
It's kind of the last adolescent profession, you know? That's not to say I think it's something I should be irresponsible about, but damn, you can have a lot of fun doing this, you know? You really can. Put aside all the horrors, and it's fun, you know? I fly to crazy places, I rent cars, I hand them back in terribly damaged condition. We rent 9 BMWs in 3 weeks in South Africa, covering the state of emergency. Everything from being stoned to hold sumps to petrol bombs to mad drunken Zulus hacking into the roof with a hatchet. You know, and I didn't have to pay for it. All I had to do was survive it, you know?
Surviving modern warfare, with its factions, zealots and martyrs, is getting more difficult for reporters. Combatants on all sides are increasingly disregarding the idea of an independent media, if it ever existed.
Many parts of the world don't like us anymore. This sort of magic about journalism, I think, has evaporated. There are factions, and there are some governments around the world who wish we were not there, and there are some who wish we were dead, as bluntly as that. We are ATM machines. We carry lots of money. We carry lots of expensive, shiny equipment, so we're a target for robbery as well. But I think the underlying reason is that there are large parts of the world that don't like us and hate us, and that is very scary.
In the Nicaraguan Civil War 25 years ago, when the US-supported dictator Anastasio Somoza battled it out with left-wing Sandinistas, one reporter sent to cover the conflict found himself suddenly under fire.
As the rounds were ricocheting and people were dying, I thought, what a way to die. What the hell are you doing here in the heat and the turmoil of Nicaragua instead of back in the States with your wife and your 2 young children? There were a couple of times when I thought my work was idiotic, when I thought I was an idiot for exposing myself to potential death. And I was not doing it for glory. I was hired as a journalist because I wanted the income as well as the personal fulfillment of being a journalist, but not at the price of dying. President Somoza is telling businessmen and shop owners that they need not be afraid, that they can open up, that he has the honor.
During his spell in Nicaragua, Bernard Shaw had to leave the country for a few days and asked his office to send in a short-term replacement. Veteran correspondent Bill Stewart flew in from New York.
He was doing a segment where soldiers were sitting around a campfire playing a guitar and singing, and he moved down the road, he and his camera crew, cameraman Jack Clark, and they were in this van. He had the band stop, and on foot he approached this guard checkpoint, and he showed his press pass, periodista, journalist, and this one soldier with an M16 rifle pointed at him and told him to get down on the ground. Well, Bill first knelt, still saying, I'm a journalist. And the soldier pointed again to him to lay prone on the ground, and he did. The soldier walked up, lowered the barrel of his rifle, and fired one round into the base of his skull.
Let him see the picture. The camera.
In effect, it summarily executed him. Somoza and his government claim that ABC News correspondent Bill Stewart was executed by Sandinista guerrillas. What they did not know was cameraman Jack Clark rolled on everything. There was the evidence. The upshot is, as soon as President Carter and all officials in the American government saw that videotape, that was the beginning of the end of Anastasio Somoza's regime. I had not called New York and asked that they send in someone to cover for me, Bill Stewart would be alive today. I'm convinced of that.
My job was to record the history happening in my country, where random roadside justice was the order of the day.
Sorius Samora is a unique war reporter, an African reporting on African wars for a world audience.
The election slogan was, "The future is in your hands." So the rebels chopped the hands off anyone they could find to stop them from voting.
When Sorius went to Liberia to report on their civil war, he was thrown into prison as a spy.
I was tortured. They brought knives, threatened to cut open my chest, eat my heart, and use my blood to write Christ Samura. You know, espionage in Liberia during war means death. You know, you have to face a firing squad. So we were charged with that, and we went to court. And even with all the very powerful lawyers we had from the UK and Liberia, nobody could listen to them. The verdict was that we should be taken into prison and we should be shot. But fortunately, like I said, we had all these powerful backings, and that made a difference. But for me, it wasn't about us. It was about those people that might still be languishing in there, and they had nobody to talk for them. As far as they were concerned, this child was the sniper. He would be shown no mercy. How can you forget those traumatic events? How can you forget looking at an 11, 12-year-old boy being beaten by 6, 7 very, very grown-up military men? How can you forget seeing a pregnant woman having her stomach split open because they want to see what sex? How can you forget a 9-year-old boy being forced to rape his own mom? How can you forget things like those?
People have this cliche about, oh, life is cheap in certain areas. No, death is cheap. It's very easy to be killed. It's very, very easy to get killed. And sometimes, of course, you can do nothing about it. A house comes down on top of you. But other times, it's a snap, quick decision. Do you cross this road or do you stay where you are? They've hit the building with another shell. I've got to run, but I know they're shooting in the street. Do you run or not? And you suddenly say, this is the right moment. Go, go! And you're committed to it. You can't turn around in the middle of the street and say, stop, I made a mistake. You can't do that. So there is this. One thing it teaches you is to make up your mind and be decisive.
While print reporters can usually choose when to run and when to hide, television journalists must always seek out the action.
This army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle.
In 1989, in China, the wide expanses of Tiananmen Square became a killing field as troops fired at random into crowds of demonstrators and passers-by.
Troop lorries were seen moving down the road. There was gunfire from those lorries.
I was beginning to think that our chances of staying alive were very poor. And the cameraman decided he would stay in the lee of a wall near a ditch, fairly well protected in the shadow, and I would run for it and go back to the hotel. It wasn't far away with the video. And as I started across this immense expanse of the corner of the square, hundreds and hundreds of yards, the soldiers opened up. And there were hundreds and hundreds of students running in all directions. Total panic. It was terrible. It was lit by the glare of these horrible sort of lights. And it was hellish.
They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
Someone collided with me. I I was stunned into me at full pelt. I was going at full pelt. And he went down. I fell right over him. I felt also pain when I went into him. And later on, I discovered the whole of part of my elbow was ripped away. Not a graze, but a sort of burn through it. And that was the bullet that had hit him. I fell over him and he was dead.
As we lay huddled on the ground, bullets whistled inches above us.
Surely the big question inevitably asked of all reporters who go to war is whether or not they feel fear as they deliberately put themselves in harm's way for the benefit of their readers, listeners, and viewers.
It's got an immense advantage. You become invisible directly you put it on. No one even glances at women here. And they get the worst seats in the vehicles.
What goes through the mind of a war reporter as he sets out once again to bring home tales from the front?
What I do know is that there's only 3 really bad times. One is the night before you leave, and you spend what you think may be your last night ever in your own bed. The second is when you say goodbye to your wife, your partner, your family, whatever, and you head out on your own. That's a bad, bad feeling. And a third time is when the wheels of the plane touch down wherever you're going, and you think, right up until now, I've been able to pull out of this. I've been able to remember a prior engagement. Now I'm here, I'm stuck, and there's an awful sinking in the stomach.
You definitely feel different shades of emotion when you're trying to take cover when there's random shelling. Some bastards up in the hillsides, and there are shells coming down. They're landing, you've no idea where, because you don't know what they're aiming at. They're just plonking stuff on the town, especially if it's mortars, which fall anywhere. It's a guessing game, and it's very unsettling. You can also find yourself facing someone with a gun, and you know by his words and appearance, his demeanour, that he intends evil against you.
Kurdish guerrilla groups have accused Iraq of carrying out more gas attacks. They say chemical bombs were dropped on 2 villages yesterday and 50 civilians were killed. Our correspondent John Simpson has visited the Kurdish town of Halabja. Viewers may find some of the scenes in his report disturbing.
We went in low to Halabja in an Iranian Air Force helicopter, hugging the hillside in order to keep away from Iraqi planes and artillery fire.
I saw the bombs coming down with the gas in it and getting closer and closer to me. I was terrified by it, terrified. And I was at Halabja 3 days, I think it was 3 days after Saddam Hussein had killed 5,000 people in the city.
The Iranians maintain that 3 separate types of gas were used. Cyanide.
You could tell which type of gas had been used to kill that particular person. There was a certain small amount of mustard gas, which doesn't by and large kill you, but does disgusting things to you. It brings you out in these huge boils and blisters, and of course does awful things to the breathing and the eyes and things that last for the rest of your life. But of the 2 gases that killed people, the nerve gas seemed to me to be absolutely disgusting. Strangles you from the inside. So the awful contorted bodies of people who had died that way. And then, weirdly, the victims of cyanide poisoning who had clearly died almost instantly. I remember finding a body of an old man whose head lying on his dining room table, still taking a bite out of a piece of bread, his teeth still stuck in the bread, died like that. And you think, when the bombs are coming down, you think, oh, God, make it the cyanide. Please make it the cyanide. Don't let it be the nerve gas. Don't let it be the mustard gas. I don't want to live like that.
Genocide comes in many forms. In Rwanda, some 800,000 innocents were murdered in 100 days in 1994, while the rest of the world stood idly by.
When your day is long is yours alone. When you're sure you've had enough of this life, hang on. Don't let yourself go. Everybody cries.
Rwanda has left a lasting impression on the journalists who witnessed the aftermath of this genocide.
I had never seen anything so brutal. I thought all this was in the past, this idea that people could be slaughtered with clubs and machetes. It was like nothing I had ever seen in my life before. Just when you got there, in a jungle, you would expect to smell gardenias and flowers, which you could, but the air was always scented with rotting corpses. There were rotting corpses everywhere. I really wish we could get the smell of death in television news. I wish people that watch these pictures could actually smell it. I'm convinced that would end it all.
And suddenly somebody noticed that one of these bodies was moving. Baby. She wasn't more than 4 months old, and she was the only one who was still alive. She had a big gash on her head, big cut, and I remembered blades of grass and dirt had got into this cut. But she was awake, she was very weak, been lying in the sun for a day. But her eyes were very lively, and she was looking around her. And there were no nurses, no doctors, no aid workers, no soldiers with medical training, just us. You know, it's clear what you have to do. You don't rush off trying to find the leaders of the militia, trying to interview them. So we picked her up. I was driving, and we were about 25 miles away from the nearest town. There was this huge convoy on foot of 1 million or whatever it was, blocking the road. And I remember driving down this road with my hand permanently on the hooter saying, "Get out of my way, please get out of my way," and then trying to get this little girl to hospital. We took her into the hospital and we said, "We found this little girl, she's been lying in the sun, she's close to death, but she's still alive. She's dehydrated, clearly," and the doctor said, "Okay." Looking around, found a set of keys, went to a cupboard, and he pulled into, I thought he was going to pull some medicine or something, I don't know. And he pulled a notebook out, a form. He said, "Okay, what's her name?" I don't know what her name is. She's, we found her lying in a, I'll just put X then, shall I? Eventually another doctor arrived and saw the urgency of the situation and took her off. And then his mood suddenly changed and he saw that something urgent was happening and he started giving her quite intrusive injections. And then there was a moment when the life just slipped away from her. And you could see that she was dead.
This war between Hutu and Tutsi left nearly 1 million, mostly Tutsi, dead. And 1 million more refugees, mostly Hutus, on the move and in camps. But these desperate displaced people also had a guilty secret. For amongst their number were many who had carried out the genocide on their Tutsi neighbors. The UN sent in an unarmed convoy with much needed food to one of the Hutu camps, accompanied by reporter James Mates and cameraman John Steele.
We came to this camp that had about 50,000 Hutu refugees. It was the middle of a high volcanic plain. The sun was beating down. It was an absolutely miserable existence, no water. There were a lot of soldiers there, Rwandan government soldiers, Hutu soldiers. They weren't supposed to be there. We were warned by the commander not to take any pictures because there are no soldiers here. Only take pictures of the refugees. Okay, there are no soldiers here. I got you. I got you. We drove into a place to offload the food for the refugees. On the way, we passed 3 heavy artillery pieces that were engaged in firing heavy shells into Kigali. I managed to get a couple of shots of it. We tried swapping tapes real quick in the back of this truck, but we didn't realize that we'd been spotted. As we were offloading the food, the soldiers came and demanded the tape, and were accusing us of being spies, and then left us to the crowd. His last words to us were, "I have no use for you. You may leave if you can." We got back into our trucks, and we were immediately surrounded by a mob that grew and grew and grew. Then the machetes came out. Then the clubs came out. Then people would come up to the windows and scream and start going, that we're going to take off your head. We were absolutely convinced that we were going to die. We started telling each other, "I hope it's quick. I hope it's quick." And then somebody would say, "Well, no, I don't think it's going to be." And in a strange way, there's almost this camaraderie that builds, that you're supporting each other, that, you know, we're going to die together. You know, this is it. We are going to die together. We're here. Out of this crowd, this fellow appeared in the window in a dark suit and an umbrella and a briefcase. And he pops in the window and he says, "Are you 2 gentlemen from Moscow?" Hello, you know, excuse me? And he says, the gentleman in the truck behind you, said that you're from Moscow. And James and I had both worked in Moscow, so we're chatting. And he's looking around at the crowd and he's saying, "Where are the soldiers? They shouldn't have left you here. They know what would have happened." And he said he was a school teacher and he would try and help. And he walked out into the crowd, and by now it's like 1,500 people, I guess, and they are dancing, they are getting themselves worked up. You know that they're going to kill you. They're just waiting for the right moment to do it. And he started talking to them and saying they're not the enemy. They're not with the Tutsi. They've brought food. Would they, if they were enemies, would they bring food to the Hutu? If you kill them, there'll be no more food. So the crowd by this time was like this dead-eyed monster. It was a thing. It wasn't individuals. It was one mass of murder waiting to commit the crime. They could taste the blood. They were really worked up and ready for it. And he came, sort of like they calmed down a bit, and he came to us and he said, "Drive out slowly. Leave. Just please leave." And we left. And as we started working through the crowd, I looked in the rearview mirror, and I saw him with his umbrella, still talking. And the crowd sort of centered on him. And then the truck turned down a road and we lost sight of him. Later that night, when James and I got back to Kigali at the UN compound, we were sitting there eating our MREs. And I said to James, "You know that guy, that school teacher?" And he said, "I know." And I said, "Do you believe in angels, James?" And James said, "Yes, I do, and I think you should too."
We in the West have perhaps become used to death in Africa. But throughout the 1990s, this same brutality came rather closer to home as neighbor fought neighbor in the streets and farms of Europe in some of the most savage conflict imaginable. Romania, Croatia, Bosnia. Places to which only recently tourists had flocked and Olympic athletes had competed became war zones.
That was the first time I think I heard guns fired in anger. And I remember Timisoara and being astonished by the sight of people who'd been injured in Europe, in my day, by gunfire, by, in effect, civil war. I thought, this can't happen in Europe. And I remember seeing this young man, he must have been about my age, 28 or 29 at the time, and he'd been shot in the chest or in the neck, and he was on some kind of ventilator, and he was lying on a bed with a rubber sheet, and the indentation that his body was making in this mattress was gradually filling up with his blood. And as his chest rose and fell, his elbows were dipping in and out of the blood. And I thought, that's a bloodbath. It's literally a bloodbath. And I'm never going to be able to use that term again.
By the early 1990s, times had changed. There were more women in the field, and the Balkan Wars gave them their big break.
It was sexy, it was fun, there were big gangs of us. And I think that's part of the attraction. And I think if you can be honest about it, you can say there were wars that we went to that we actually felt we could, you know, be useful and do things. And I think I certainly felt in the Balkans that we could be useful and we could do things, and it was important to bear witness.
I was keen and young, and I wanted to do a good job. I wanted to see what was happening. I'd covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, but this was the first conflict, and I had no idea at all. I arrived with a notebook, a pen, and a map. We didn't have flak jackets, we didn't have helmets, we didn't have satellite phones, we didn't even have mobile phones.
In Sarajevo, in the evenings, we would sit and we'd drink bottles of whiskey. I hate whiskey. But it numbed us, and we needed to do that. And it wasn't partying the way a teenager in London would go to a rave. It was anesthetic.
It's a very intense place, you know, and I think probably, I can't vouch for the sex, but there's probably a lot of drink. There is a lot of drink. But I also think when you're in places that are really quite dangerous, you sort of need to keep yourself together. And I think the days of Vietnam when, you know, or Cambodia, where you kind of, the lads went to the local den and smoked opium and got laid, you know, we've become a much straighter society, you know.
I think people use sex in the same way they use drugs or alcohol, as a way of escaping, a momentary, fleeting escape from the horror outside.
The Balkans also attracted the well-known veterans of war reporting. But even for them, this was something new.
Bosnia was different to me because we were in the middle of it for so long, because it was about civilians. It was about flags and civilians and the driving of people from their homes. It was about the weakness of the Western democracies. It was about a failed state. And journalistically, it was about journalists who could no longer pretend that they were just onlookers, bystanders. We were caught up in the middle of it.
Sarajevo was a very dangerous war because you couldn't, there was no way of figuring it out. In Vietnam, you could largely figure out what was going on most of the time. In the countryside in Bosnia, you could figure out most of the time what was going on. But in Sarajevo, it was just a question of when and where a shell was going to hit. It was fired by some Serb in the hills.
I like to tell stories. I think there are certain things people should know. They need to know. That sounds egotistical, and aren't I a grand person? That's not the case. It's that I just think that it's such a worthwhile thing to do, to tell people what's out there. Because you're not going to change the world, but at least, for example, in Sarajevo, I think we all thought, at least no one will be able to say we didn't know, because by God you did, because we told you. And if you don't fix it, at least you can't say we didn't know.
The United Nations Secretary-General has urged pulling out UN peacekeepers from the Bosnian capital Sarajevo.
The attack on the Red Cross in Sarajevo earlier this week, a blatant sign that no flag and no charity is respected in this conflict.
Late last night, to the huge relief...
By the 20th of May 1992, after suffering unprecedented casualties, the Red Cross, the UN, and the International Press Corps had all decided to leave Sarajevo en masse. There would be no independent outsiders to bear witness any longer. But one reporter changed his mind and returned.
I got into the heart of the city and abandoned my car, which was very shortly thereafter hit by a mortar and destroyed. So now I was in the same position as everybody else in the city. And I knew that my paper would be very unhappy with my being back there, having left and having no agreement to be back. And I calculated, since it was a Friday, that they wouldn't even notice where I was until the Monday when the senior editors were back in the building in New York. So I had 48 hours to tell the story of this astonishing medieval attack on a great European city. The whole city was aflame. And I was just about to write my story when a young boy in the flat where I'd taken refuge came running and said, "There's something you've got to see." It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the Sunday. And I said to him, "I really, I've seen enough. No, you must come." So with a certain amount of ill humor, I followed this boy and headed up what's called the walking street to the point where a few days earlier a Serb mortar had hit a crowd of people queuing for bread. There, to my astonishment, in this utterly deserted street was a man in full evening dress on a steel chair right on the spot where the mortar hit, playing a cello, playing Albinoni's Adagio. I was terrified to be there. I hid in the lee of the buildings on the side from which the artillery fire was coming, and it was literally mortars exploding into the masonry all around. When he was done, he picked up his cello and came over to me and said, "What on earth are you doing?" He said, "Well, you know that many of my fellow citizens died here, and I am the leading cellist of the Sarajevo Symphony Orchestra. And that's all I know what to do, is play a cello."
Sarajevo was a turning point for reporters covering war. They had to figure out new ways to protect themselves from an enemy that could be anywhere, in a war with fewer boundaries than ever before.
Everything changed for me in the summer of 1992. I was driving across the airport runway in Sarajevo, which was a free fire zone, no man's land, in my Vauxhall Carlton, and got quite badly shot up. And the Vauxhall Carlton actually stopped one of the bullets, to which I wrote later and thanked Vauxhall for making an armoured car without knowing it. But I could very easily have been killed. And I got in touch with the BBC. I said, "Look, we've got to have an armoured car." And they got me one in 2 weeks. And that wasn't enough. We had to have flak jackets and so on. And we militarised ourselves in very short order.
The armoured vehicles and the flak jackets may have helped save journalists' lives, but they came with a cost attached.
Sarajevo is a formal town, so we thought a navy blue vest would be appropriate.
I thought it was reckless not to wear a flak jacket most days in Sarajevo, even though it made you feel miserable. And I don't mean because it was hot. It wasn't hot. I mean, when you're wearing a flak jacket and you're doing the story in Sarajevo and you're mixing among civilians on the streets who are not wearing a flak jacket, it's a terrible, terrible feeling.
One of the world's most experienced combat correspondents, Alan Pizzi, reports on the guns of Sarajevo.
The opposing front line is only 50 yards from here, and the only contact the two sides...
It's a double-edged sword. Flak jackets are a tool. They should not become a prop. And unfortunately, I think they've become a prop. A lot of people go out there and think, I'm a war correspondent because I've got a flak jacket. And they think, I'm okay. Sorry, you're okay from here to here. The rest of you is not okay.
Every journalist who survived the Balkans, and 84 did not, has his or her own story of near death.
I have twice had bullets in my clothing. Once in Kosovo, where a bullet hit my mobile telephone, which was in a pocket, and it went through a large roll of banknotes, Deutschmarks, 6,000 Deutschmarks. It was probably the banknotes that slowed it down, and it embedded in the phone, and I just got a very large bruise and a certain amount of blood. Another time I was in Sarajevo drinking a cup of coffee in someone's flat, but on the front line, leaned forward to have a sip, leaned back, there was a crack, and where I was, a bullet went, but it nicked my arm and went through some clothing.
The Balkan Wars, more than any other modern conflict, left the present generation of reporters with indelible images of the violence and destruction.
In Bosnia, anytime a journalist would pull up, the kids would just run out and start, yelling bonbons and jump up and down. And we all carried little candies with us, and we, throw them to the kids. And I took some candies, and I was passing them out to the kids, and there was one little girl. And she was holding my hand and squeezing it. And she just looked at me. She had this big smile on her face. Just a lovely, lovely girl. And they were all screaming for more. And I said, do you want more? Do you want more? And she said, yes, 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 Moling, please, please, more. And I said, okay, wait here. I have to go in this building. I'll come back, and I'll bring you more candies from the truck. And all the kids jumped up and down and said, oh, we, hooray, hooray. So we go into this building to talk to these army officers. And while we're in there, I can hear the kids through a window, laughing, playing in the street. And we heard a few outgoing rounds from like an AK-47 above our heads, which would be the Bosnian side, going across the Drina River into the Serb side of Sarajevo. And then there was a sound of a high-powered round. I knew it as soon as I heard it. A Serb sniper. And the street went quiet. And we sort of looked at each other, and somebody said, I hope to God nothing's happened out there. And I knew immediately something had happened in my heart. And I went rushing out, and I saw some people screaming in the street, an old woman. And I followed her eye line to the middle of the road, and there was this little girl lying in the middle of the road in a pool of blood, lying on her back. And I didn't go rush up to her. I didn't try and help. I ran to the truck and got my camera. And I started filming the situation. Some men picked her up, put her in the back of a car, and they were actually blocking my shot. And I grabbed one of the men in the back of the shoulder, yanked him back, and I went in with a camera. And I was looking at her through the eyepiece. I don't know if she was conscious or falling into unconsciousness, but she just kind of looked into the lens. And then her eyes just kind of lost focus. And the car took off and went away.
Today, in a street just a few hundred yards from here, a sniper claimed his latest victim. A young life ended with the squeeze of a trigger. In Sarajevo, they'd started to think the senseless killings were over. Instead, Mirella's neighbours wept in frustration and anger. You're killing innocent children, this man screamed. Why don't you shoot me instead? At the Kosovo hospital, the innocent schoolgirl was already a statistic.
And I was cleaning the dust off the front of the lens. And I was looking into the glass of the lens, and just dust, dust, dust. And the more I looked at the lens, the more something hit me. And I was seeing my face in the lens. And I was looking at my eyes in the lens. And then I realized that that girl had seen herself in the lens, my lens, as she was dying and bleeding. And it just hit me that the last thing she saw in her life was her own self dying. I did that to her. And then I just said, I want to go to Sniper Alley to take pictures of people running. And Terry said, okay, so we ran down there, and he insisted I wore a flak jacket, but what he didn't know is I was taking the plates, the armored plates, out of the flak jacket. And we parked, and he said, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to run with these people. And, you know, he said, no, you know, what are you talking about? You can't run with these people. And I said, I'm running. And I said, it's okay, Terry, everybody dies in Sarajevo. I was trying to, like, brush it off with a joke. But at that moment, I really wanted to die. I really wanted to take a bullet. So I started running back and forth across the street, back and forth across the street. There was a big oak tree in the middle of the road that people would hide behind halfway. And I just kept doing it till I couldn't run anymore. And at that particular moment, I was praying for a bullet. I wanted somebody to kill me. I wanted somebody to take me out for what I'd just done. And that's when I lost it completely. And everything was a bit of a blur for the next few days, until I wound up on having a nervous breakdown in Heathrow Airport in London.
For Mirella, the day had started with sunshine and friends. It ended alone in a hospital mortuary.
John Steele's most graphic pictures of Mirella Plotic, the little girl he filmed that day, were never broadcast and have now been lost. But her image is with him forever.
A correspondent, a reporter, a scribbler, a sound man, even a stills cameraman can turn away. The nature of television is that you have to let the action happen within the frame, which means you have to concentrate, which means you have to count, which means you have to stare. And you keep looking for pictures and looking for pictures, which means you have to just look at this stuff. You have to look at the blood, you have to look at the carnage, you have to look at the suffering, you have to look at the faces screaming at you in pain. And you take that in. You are the camera. It goes from the lens, through the eyepiece, into your eyes, into your brain, into your heart, into your soul, and it never leaves. It stays there forever.
Afghanistan is a country that has been racked by continuous war for more than 20 years. In fact, today's war on terror has its roots in a previous war in the 1980s, the conflict between the Russian-backed Afghan government and the US-supported Mujahideen. That earlier conflict gave one reporter an unusual introduction to a man who would one day become the world's most notorious terrorist.
This is the outskirts of the former Soviet base of Samarkand. The Mujahideen are desperately fighting to hold on to this whole area.
While we were filming, an extraordinarily tall and very, I thought, absolutely hypnotizingly beautiful figure came forward, as a man with a beard and in his 30s, I suppose, and this wonderful white clothes. I mean, how he managed to keep them so white and under such difficult conditions, God knows. And he got up on a wall and he started shouting and sort of haranguing the Mujahideen. And after a bit, I said to the interpreter, quite sort of innocently, what's he saying? And he says, oh, he's saying they should kill you. And I thought, wait a moment, you
why shouldn't they kill you as well? You're the interpreter. Then I realized it was just us, the foreigners, the infidels. And they had a vote about it. There were 7 of them, and 3 voted in favor of the proposition that they should kill us then and there because we were infidels, and 4 thought, on balance, business before pleasure, let's carry on mortaring, and then, after that we can see. This figure in white was furious and stormed off and went over to a truck driver who was sitting there in a truck that had delivered all the munitions for the Mujahideen, and he was talking to him, shouting at him. We could hear that. I said to the interpreter, "What's he saying now?" He says, "Oh, giving him $500 to come and run you over." We waited, but the driver then shook his head and smiled. And this figure in white went off in a terrible state, and he was sleeping there on a bed in a sort of barracks there, and he lay down. We all followed in afterwards, the Mujahideen and us and everything. We saw him beating on his pillow and weeping in frustration. I want to kill these people. Why can't they let me kill? Anyway, I didn't think very much more about it until I saw the first photograph of Osama bin Laden that was published in the papers. And immediately you couldn't forget those sensationally handsome features.
In 1991, just 2 years after Simpson's encounter in the Afghan wilderness with the tall Arab who would one day become the most wanted man on the planet, America and its allies went to war against another Arab enemy, who had once been their friend, Saddam Hussein of Iraq.
Holy cow. That was a large airburst that we saw. It was filling the sky.
The outbreak of the First Gulf War was reported live on air by the fledgling 24-hour news station, CNN.
Now let's return to Baghdad. We have 3 reporters in the Al Rashid Hotel. Come back in.
There's a bomb that has come down now. You'll probably hear the report at the refinery in just a minute. We saw the bomb come down. We saw the flash, and you just heard the explosion. And it was a big blast of bomb blast that came through this window.
I've just come from checking out the other side of the hotel, and it's equally intense on the other side.
Though 45 other Western journalists were in the same hotel, CNN had the only working phone line out of Baghdad.
It felt like we were in the center of hell. It really did. And it smelled like it somewhat, too. The acrid smoke coming from power lines and power stations that were just exploding around us. And I had made my peace with the fact that I could be dead by morning. In fact, Tom Johnson, then the president of CNN, said that he did not expect the 3 of us to survive the night. We were very much aware that our lives were in jeopardy. In war, one moment you're alive, the next moment you're dead. We knew that at any moment we could die. The most harrowing moment for me came when the Iraqis had less than a block and a half away from the Al Rashid Hotel where we were on the 9th floor, a Soviet anti-aircraft missile battery, a SAM site. And they fired 3 missiles from this launcher. And I said, uh-oh, you know what's going to happen next. We knew that there would be a response by the either British or American warplanes, and that response came within 25 minutes, and it literally shook and rocked the hotel. In fact, we went to the floor and we were on our knees. We went out into the corridor on our floor to avoid the concussions and avoid possibly the walls collapsing. That's how intense it was.
In fact, none of the 1,600 or so journalists covering the war were killed by Allied bombs or friendly fire during the 6 weeks of hostilities of that Gulf War. It was to be a very different story 12 years later.
days we'd camped in the desert, watching the military build-up as tanks and troops edged closer to the Iraqi border. Now it was...
Terry Lloyd was one of the most experienced war reporters of his generation. Terry Lloyd went to war again in March 2003.
Our route would take us in the tank and tyre tracks of the Royal Marines and the US Expeditionary Force, who'd crept into battle positions during the dead of night.
Terry deliberately chose not to become a so-called embedded reporter with the British or Americans. Instead, he and his crew hired 2 jeeps and worked as independents or unilaterals. On the 22nd of March, he filed this report.
This, until a few hours ago, was an Iraqi frontline stronghold. Nothing much to see, just a couple of porter cabins where the Iraqi flag still flies. But now the British...
The next day, Terry and his crew set out for Basra. Shortly after passing some American troops, to their surprise, they then saw in the distance a small group of Iraqi soldiers in pickup trucks.
And then suddenly I see to my left a car driving right next to me with some Iraqi soldiers in there. And they're looking at me, and I'm looking at them, and they're giving me signs like thumbs up and showing they do like this direction, thumbs up. And just at that moment, really heavy gunfire starts, coming from sort of 2 o'clock, that position. First thing that went was the front window. I dug down straight away. I went under the steering wheel. I protected my head, and I remember that the whole interior of the car was blowing into pieces. It was absolute nightmare. I mean, I was absolutely sure I was going to die. I was absolutely sure. And I looked to the right, a split second later, and Terry Lloyd is gone. He's not in the car anymore. The car is still going automatically. I mean, I kept my foot on the pedal, I guess, and it goes off road. I don't know. You lose your orientation as well, and then eventually the car stops. I look up and I see that the whole rooftop is on fire. I jump out just on time because then the big fire started. It sort of exploded.
Terry Lloyd's body was later recovered, but the other 2 crew members have never been found.
We got a critical patient, needs to get out of here. Get back!
Of the 15 journalists who died and 2 who are still missing from the 43 days of open hostilities, 5 were killed by so-called friendly fire and 5 by Iraqi forces, with 1 more the victim of a Kurdish suicide bomber. It is the highest journalist casualty rate per week of war ever. By far the largest number of dead reporters, 10 in all, met their end in Saddam's capital, Baghdad. And those who reported the war from there always felt they were the most vulnerable.
There were personal issues of safety that just simply cannot be underestimated with this war. This is not just a straight danger from bombs and bullets. The dangers were from the use of weapons of mass destruction. The dangers were from chaos, from civil disorder in the wake of regime change, and carrying British and American passports, don't forget. And the danger was also of being used as human shields by a state that was about to be destroyed.
There was to be no massacre of reporters or hostage-taking as Saddam's state was destroyed. Instead, the Iraqi National Guard and Saddam's henchmen appeared to disappear into thin air, for the time being at least. Then, on April the 8th, the day before Baghdad fell to American troops, tragedy again struck the press corps.
Journalists reporting this conflict in Baghdad have also been targeted.
The offices of the Arab satellite TV channel Al Jazeera were hit by missiles, killing a reporter and wounding a cameraman. It was the second time Al Jazeera had been bombed by the US Air Force, the first occasion being in Kabul during the Afghan War.
I think the shock was much greater this time round than Kabul, by far, basically because we lost a very dear and what we believe a talented colleague. But more importantly, we felt safe. Since before war broke out, we have been in communication with the Pentagon. We've given them all relevant details. The location of our office in terms of longitude and latitude, the height off the ground, the name of the street, the name of the building, the number of the building, a description of the surroundings. So we were very shocked to learn that actually, in spite of all this information, the commanders on the ground, or whoever took the decision, deemed it important to send out fighter jets to bomb a very well-known media bureau.
It struck me at the time that to be in the Al Jazeera bureau would be an extremely dangerous place to be, because it was right in the heart of an area of possibly a square mile where the most serious battle for Baghdad took place on that morning. Unlike what happened in Kabul, where the attack on the Al Jazeera office was deliberate, there's no question about that, and in my view, utterly reprehensible.
I think we are faced there with deliberate attacks on journalists to shut them up. Now, I mean, Al Jazeera is not my type of reporting. There's a lot about it which I don't like, but then there's a lot about Fox television I don't like, and I wouldn't advocate anybody bombing Fox to stop them reporting the way they want to report. Actually, if I'm honest about it and open about it, I think it's a war crime. I'd like to know who gave those decisions, and I would like to see those people prosecuted.
We don't deliberately target journalists. We don't deliberately target civilians, flat out. Now, other forces in the world, I can't speak for them, but I can speak for any U.S. military force and say that that's absolutely certain.
Hours later, an American tank fires at the Reuters news agency in the Palestine Hotel, where all Western journalists are based. The Americans say they were responding to sniper fire, but dozens of us were on the roof of the hotel and none of us heard any gunfire at all.
Of all the places I've been to over the last 13 or so years, and all the different conflicts and awful images within those conflicts I've seen, the worst for me was seeing the dead body of Taras Prochus. I'd gone up to try and help. He was just lying there on his back, and where his camera had been, where the round had come in. And he was a father, I think he had a young son. And it was 48 hours before the war ended.
Some of what happened in the case of Palestine was the difficulty of fighting in any urban area. You can't always tell exactly where the fire is coming from. You can't tell who is crouched with a shoulder-fired weapon behind something and who is crouched with a camera behind something, especially at distance. You can't always parse out the amount of time it would take to sort out exactly what you see, and so decisions are made at a very, very low level. And when that happens, inevitably, in warfare, mistakes occur.
Today, we witnessed American forces fight in the heart of this city. Iraqis were caught by surprise. As we approached the American positions, we were stopped from filming.
Because of what had happened at the hotel, I just thought these are young American boys who are in a dangerous, hostile city.
Nice to see you. Great to meet you. Thanks for the support.
And hence, going to meet the American soldiers, when we got out of the car and walking towards them, we held our arms open like this and walked towards them with TV written across, bowing down like this. I mean, that's the level of how afraid we were of going to meet the American soldiers.
Okay, let me just cut in here. Right, this is a roadblock. We don't know who they are. A little bit uncertain here. They're waving us on.
In the last few years, news organizations have started to train their staff with special courses to help them deal with the dangers they may confront in conflict zones.
Right, they're saying don't film. Put the camera down.
Since time immemorial, a few journalists have responded to war by taking up arms themselves. But a new sense of being specifically targeted has also led to a new phenomenon: independent journalists protected by armed guards.
To Crete, no fighting. Checkpoint.
On Sunday, April the 13th, CNN reporter Brent Sadler and his protection detail got involved in a gunfight in the town of Tikrit.
Okay, under attack. Under attack. We're okay, we're okay. They tried to stop us, and our armed guard pulled his machine gun, opened fire to get us through there. Thank that's as far as we're going to push it today.
Brent Sadler's team had been the target of a documented assassination attempt in northern Iraq a few weeks before that, an attempt on the part of a faction to throw explosives into the hotel that they were staying in before the war started. So it would have been irresponsible of CNN not to ensure that Brent Sadler's team of all teams had proper security.
Still moving along. Under fire again.
He was traveling with a security person who was not armed, but there was a weapon in the car. They were pursued by at least one, if not two vehicles with heavy machine guns and came under fire. At that point in time, the security advisor picked up the weapon and used it, and he saved their lives. Though I'm upset and downhearted that it happened, I'm not sure what the alternative would have been. For Brent Sadler and his team to take a bullet for the cause is not the alternative. I know what I would have done. I would have picked up the weapon myself.
Thank you very much. Now, everybody out there, if indeed you have the viewership you claim, every idiot out there with a gun sees a car marked TV, which we mark for our protection. Hey, we're neutral. No, we're not. We've got gunmen in there. So why not shoot us first? No, I don't like that at all. That's very upsetting.
I accept part of the allegation that says that after it had happened, we made rather too much use of it. I don't accept the allegation that we should not have transmitted it live, because we were live when it happened, and it would have been, I think, a curious editorial decision to butt out of it. That would have left the audience thinking what the hell's going on here. But I'm content. I accept the allegation that we made rather too much of it in the hours after it, and I think, applying hindsight, I should not have done that.
I think that you really come dangerously close to crossing the line when you, in effect, become a combatant with the principles on the ground there. That's a no-no. We journalists for decades have operated under the fiction that having a press pass or a press card somehow is a fig leaf of protection.
There was a Fox News reporter in Afghanistan who made a very big show of carrying a handgun and how he was going to kill Osama bin Laden if he saw him. That jerk endangered the life of every war journalist in the field from then on.
May 2003, near Washington, D.C. They have gathered to commemorate the journalists who died in action the previous year. 2002 was bad, 31 dead, but 2003 will be worse, far worse. The keynote speaker is the father of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter kidnapped and murdered by Islamists in Pakistan in January 2002.
In addition to being an innocent, unarmed journalist pursuing the line of his profession, Danny was killed for a purpose. To his killers, he represented the ideas that every person in every civilized society aspires to uphold: modernity, openness, pluralism, freedom of inquiry, truth, and respect for all people.
With total contempt for norms of decency and morality, Daniel Pearl's kidnappers filmed him stating his Jewish heritage before proudly displaying themselves murdering him. With Daniel's parents' permission, we show part of that video.
My name is Daniel Pearl. I'm a Jewish American. I come from, on my father's side, a family of Zionists. My father's Jewish. My mother's Jewish. I'm Jewish.
This emphasis on the journalist's Jewish origins eerily echoes the anti-Semitism of Hitler and the Nazis. But ironically, Daniel Pearl's last words have made him a symbol of human dignity and freedom of choice. Few reporters die in quite such gruesome circumstances as Daniel Pearl, but there is no doubt that journalists at war are now all too often fair game for any combatant with a grudge. Award-winning cameraman and director James Miller made his reputation covering war. James's last project was to be a film about the effect of conflict on children.
He concentrated in his films on the lives of individuals caught up in much bigger situations and gave voice to those people. He was a brilliant cinematographer and understood the power of the image, and it was important to him for people to see those people and their stories and to tell the story.
On the 2nd of May, James was filming his last sequence in Gaza before heading back home. He and his colleague Syra Shah had been tipped off that the home of one of the children in their film was to be demolished by Israeli army bulldozers.
He had been filming for a period of 4 hours. They were on a well-lit veranda filming both the bulldozers working and the family. Then the bulldozers stopped working. It had gone quiet in the area, and they stopped filming. There'd been no shooting for, I believe, 45 minutes. It was quiet, and the Israeli Defense Forces, their 2 armoured personnel carriers that were there, had turned their lights off and their engines off. They decided they could exit and leave the house. They were given a white flag by the family. James changed his helmet for one that had TV and fluorescent letters. They were all wearing flak jackets with TV written on them, and they walked slowly towards the 2 armoured personnel carriers. They were shouting all the time that they were British journalists and identifying themselves. James had a torch that was lighting the white flag. Suddenly there was a shot. They remained standing still. And some seconds later, I believe 13 seconds later, there was another shot that killed James. He fell to the floor, dead. And Syra Shah and his translator Abood dropped down too. There were then 5 more shots. And Syra became aware of Abood shouting loudly, and then they began to realise that James was hurt. There's a very small area between a flak jacket and a helmet, which will mean that a shot is fatal. I don't believe it was a lucky shot. I believe he was directly targeted.
There is a phrase in both the Talmud and the Quran: he who takes a single life kills a world entire. The bullet that killed James Miller not only took the life of a distinguished journalist, but took a husband, a father, a brother, and a son. The Israeli Defense Force has held an internal investigation of James Miller's killing, but to date his family say they have received no adequate explanation as to the circumstances of his death, and they are campaigning for an independent inquiry. James was the 5th journalist to die at the hands of Israeli soldiers since the start of the most recent Palestinian uprising in September 2000. Freedom of the press is the very essence of democracy. So when the armed forces of democratic governments are involved in killing the messenger, we should recognize that democracy itself is under threat and demand that those responsible are brought to account. Such is the threat to reporters today that since 1992, nearly 300 journalists have been killed in conflict, and of them, nearly 200 are believed not simply to have been accidentally caught up in crossfire, but to have been deliberately targeted by their killers.